All right, it's 2 minutes past, so let's just get started. I anyway will introduce a little bit first. So welcome everyone to the Modeling Perspective Speak. This is the last installment of the spring edition, but we will be back in fall, so stay in touch and keep an eye on your mailboxes. The series has its roots in the COVID-19 modeling hubs, but is now much broader and is really meant to cover the interface of disease modeling and public health. And I think today's speaker fits that profile quite well. So with us today is Shweta Bansal, this professor at the Department of Biology at Georgetown University, where she leads a disease ecology and network epidemiology research lab. And this is really a field of interdisciplinary research, linking network science, spatial disease, and social behavior to inform public health decision-making. I will hand over to her soon for this very exciting talk, but first, a little bit of housekeeping. Shweta will talk for about half an hour, and keep your questions to the end. We'll have a good 20 minutes for discussion. And aim to really end at 10 to the hour. If you have any questions during the talk, you can put them in the chat and address them at the end during the discussion session. And with that, over to you, Shweta. Feel free to share your screen.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much all for having me this afternoon. Good afternoon. Hopefully everyone's doing well as we head into summer here. I hadn't realized I was the last speaker of the series, so we'll try to make this a good one. So I was just telling Eva, this is wonderful that you all have this community in Europe with the modeling hub. Honestly, we could learn a lot here in the US. So I'm hoping to share some of the kind of ongoing work in my research group with you all. And like Eva said, I'll try to do my best to leave time at the end for discussion. And then I'm also, of course, happy to have offline discussions. So social behavior and infectious diseases, especially respiratory infectious diseases, is kind of where I tend to really spend my time. And the fact that social behavior is critical to infectious disease transmission won't be a surprise to anyone. It's really the fact that we live in a social society and have interactions between individuals that really allows infection to transmit. But if, it's not really just at the individual level that those interactions matter, zooming out from the individual scale, interactions between communities due to travel by humans or animals, that, really allows infection to kind of spatially diffuse over local and then also very large global scales. And so really thinking of this as kind of within population and between population connectivity is where my effort tends to sit. And really, our goal is to, of course, understand this, to better understand disease dynamics and think about control strategies. But of course, when it comes to this connectivity isn't static. There's behaviors that we engage in as hosts that really can, create dynamics in behavior. So these can be both preventative actions, such as vaccination, or social distancing, or behavioral impacts that are caused by the disease itself, such as sickness behaviors or other behaviors that really are caused by the fact that there's, our immune system is being activated. And so so all of this really kind of creates complexity for infectious disease dynamics. And what I contend, partially because of this complexity, but really because we kind of haven't invested in this as a community, host social behavior still remains one of the biggest gaps in our understanding of infectious disease dynamics. Because we don't think about behavior between different species, right? We lose out on opportunities to predict emergence of disease. Because we don't have a great understanding of the kind of dynamics of behavior and how disease really impacts behavior, our ability to forecast disease is really hampered. And then because we don't always appreciate the nonlinear consequences of anti-mitigation behavior, our ability to eliminate infections has been limited as well. And this is something we've learned over and over these past 4 years. So the sort of effort of my group is to really think about how behavioral heterogeneity and connectivity drive disease transmission, and how we can optimize this or we can understand this better to optimize surveillance and control of disease. So of course we think about behavior at the individual scale. This is usually what people think of when they think of behavioral dynamics mattering for disease, and certainly a lot of our effort has been on this front to really, especially to think about disease emergence as well as intervention design. But more recently, we've also been putting a lot of our efforts on the landscape scale, right? So really thinking about behavioral heterogeneities across geography, and how that spatial structure and that spatial connectivity really drive disease emergence, and again, how we can think about optimal surveillance and control with this. And to really care, why we should care about the landscape effects of behavior and infectious disease dynamics in general, we really don't have to look very far for a textbook example. The COVID pandemic really provided a solid example of this, especially in large democracies like the US and India, where really there was a vast heterogeneity in kind of when and where cases of COVID-19 were occurring over time. And of course, we understand, right, that such geographic heterogeneity in cases is driven by spatial variation, and I would argue spatial structure or autocorrelation due to a vast number of factors, right? Behavioral ones, demography, environmental factors, economic ones, as well as kind of public health resources and inequities. And again, the more vast the area, the more complex this geographical variation tends to be. But of course, if there was just really spatial heterogeneity at play, we would know how to handle that. We would need a lot of resources, but our public health approaches would just require a lot of tailoring to each community. And in principle, we could deal with that well. But the complexity and nonlinearity really comes into the fact that each of these communities that are different from each other aren't islands. They are in fact connected, and they're connected via physical mobility, of course, but they're also connected via social connectivity, which really influences behavior. So this connectivity, what it does is it really amplifies the impact of this heterogeneity, but also creates nonlinear effects that are very challenging to predict. And so to be able to understand such a complex problem, of course, we would want vast amounts of data, right? Our data wish list would be long, right? We would want high resolution data in a geographical and temporally specific way. We'd want it to have large geographic scope. We want it to be, high coverage with large sample sizes. We'd want to know a lot about the data collection method and the known biases. And we'd want this, of course, for not just disease data, but all those covariate data underneath, whether it be behavioral, social, environmental, et cetera. The reality, of course, of data in infectious disease dynamics is far from this, right? Public data, especially data collected by public government agencies, tends to face a lot of challenges with respect to spatial scale. In the United States, we have a unique problem where each state does its own data collection. So we end up with sort of varying data definitions and reporting rates and delays by each state. Doing deduplication across different data systems is challenging. And honestly, I could keep going on this list of challenges, but I'm guessing I don't need to convince anyone in this group that there are many challenges. And so we've been in my group trying to think about how we get around this, right? Certainly just relying on public health data and public data in moments of crises has been highly limiting. And so one of the things we've been thinking about is how do we take advantage of opportunistic data sources for this purpose, where opportunistic data sources might come from social media or personal device tracking, health databases or sensors, where these are data sources that are collected for other purposes besides epidemiological ones, but are, we can certainly maybe think about taking advantage of them for public health purposes, to our advantage. Now, the use of such such data sets certainly increased over the last 4 years with the pandemic, and I think this really came from a place of need. But you'll notice I still have a question mark at the top of my slide here, and I think that's not so much skepticism for this for these databases, but really an indication of the fact that we still have a lot of work to do to make them useful. And the reason is that, of course, these data sources kind of provide a lot of opportunities and fill a lot of gaps that are left behind by public data collection, including improved resolution, better timeliness, access to hidden populations. But there's still a large number of challenges with these data sources as well. Most of all, the fact that they are opportunistic and are not collected based on a study, a statistical sampling design. And so there's representativeness and bias issues. There might be noise issues. And then, of course, there's ethics and privacy issues because they're opportunistic data sets. And all of these are really important to cover, to be able to understand and resolve, I would say, to be able to really take full advantage of these opportunistic data sets in our field. And so today I just want to share a few examples of our work around this, about using these data sets. And this is all work that's been done by some amazing junior researchers in my group. So I want to make sure to give them all the credit here. And so I'll start with some examples of how we've used these data sets to characterize spatial heterogeneity in behavior and disease. The first behavioral focus on is contact behavior, where, of course, the contact is the social interaction capable of spreading disease. And, again, it's very, very central to our understanding of disease risk and how it varies within and between populations. But data on this has been, far and few between, especially for the United States. In Europe, you all have had Polymod for the last decade and a half, whereas in the US, we really haven't had a data source besides some very, very, very small studies that help us understand contact. And so we really haven't known what the spatial temporal variation in contact is. So for this, we took advantage of a data set that was collected via a social media survey over the pandemic. And this was, really large scale, where we had about 18 million respondents over the course of its first year. And so we just, for starters, modeled this using GAM models, generalized additive models, to just understand the spatial temporal heterogeneity in contact. And again, because the sample size is very big, we can do this at a very fine scale, and we can produce a map like this that helps us understand number of contacts by location over time. And of course, by looking at this map, you can see that there's some stark structure that kind of pops out immediately. And really being able to do this, right, again, in a crisis is critical to understanding infection risk. But of course, we also want to understand things more generally for when such data isn't available. And so we wanted to kind of understand, for example, what are the, cross urban rural classes, where 1 is the most urban and 6 is the most rural in the United States. How do the number of contacts vary? This is really important for understanding whether, whether transmission is density or frequency dependent, and how, urban versus rural environments really differ in terms of contact. And so this pattern, is what we got. And of course, this was an effect of the fact that there was a pandemic going on. So what we really wanted to do was understand what this pattern might look like in a non-pandemic setting. But of course, the non-pandemic data was unobserved to us because the data collection didn't start till 2020. And so we used a simple statistical approach to essentially take the contact data and control, sort of remove the effect of disease from it to be able to estimate number of contacts in non-pandemic settings. And in this context, of course, our urban-rural patterns shift so that urban areas are higher contacts than rural ones. So from this point, right, of course, this was kind of our first effort to think about behavior, but we wanted to think about other behaviors as well. So secondly, we wanted to kind of think about masking. And so we went back to the survey and looked at masking data from it. But our first attempt to look at this produced this map, which if you can't see the legend, it suggests that every US community, every US county was masking, 90 to 100% of the population was masking over time during the pandemic. Now, for anybody who may not have visited the US during this time, this was not very much not the case, right? So we understood that there must be some bias in this data that we need to worry about. And so we realized that we needed to, estimate this bias, but of course we didn't have a direct way of doing it. So indirectly, what we looked at was vaccination data from this same survey. And because vaccination data is something we have ground truth for, by comparing the ground truth, sort of public data on vaccination, we were able to compare that to the survey data and estimate a bias for every location across the United States. And that allowed us to kind of model using just a Bayesian binomial model here with partial pooling, allowed us to model spatial temporal masking over the United States. And we incorporated that bias into it. And now the map made a lot more sense, where again, we found that an urban-rural gradient where urban areas tended to be better maskers than rural ones. We also found an interesting effect here, whereas of course, right, we were able to estimate this bias, but especially with such opportunistic data sets, we don't have the ability to do this normally. And so we were able to recover a sort of a classic social science result here, that if instead of asking people about their own masking behavior, you asked them about their community's masking behavior, you get a fairly bias corrected estimate without needing to do that bias correction, which is useful for future such efforts. And so we were kind of moving along and understanding different behavioral dynamics, really capturing the spatial and temporal heterogeneity in them through the COVID pandemic. But one thing kept kind of bothering us. So over and over, we would see effects like this. So to orient you, this is fall 2020. This is September 2020 at the beginning of the x-axis, and about March 2021 at the end of the x-axis. And this is the surge of COVID-19 in Chicago, for example. And what we find when we look at the time series for different behavioral estimates, masking, contact, the proportion of people staying home, right? What we find is that leading up to the surge in cases, there's really not a big shift in behavioral dynamics. And this was, of course, surprising to us, because if behavior is critical to infectious disease transmission, there should be something that predicts when and why a surge happens. And so we figured there's probably something we're missing here. And so either we're not capturing kind of the right behavior, or that we're missing seasonality in behavior. Now, this was a point in the pandemic where we understood that seasonality was at play for SARS-CoV-2, but it was unlikely to be temperature and humidity and the classic environmental indicators that were really predicting that seasonality. And seasonality in behavior is always something that's kind of known to be a predictor, but is not something that's been empirically studied. And so we took it upon ourselves to kind of characterize the seasonality in behavior. In particular, we thought about the fact that because this was a virus that was spreading really efficiently in indoor environments, what we really needed to understand was not just general contact, but the propensity of contact or interactions or human activity in general occurring in indoor versus outdoor environments. So for this, we used another opportunistic data source, which is based on kind of mobile app-based location tracking for 5.5 million locations around the country. And so we basically characterized or classified each of these locations as indoor or outdoor. So schools and grocery stores, businesses were classified as indoors, and amusement parks and farmers markets were outdoors. What this allowed us to do was really disentangle mobility by indoor and outdoor locations and define a metric, which is what you see on this y-axis here, which is mean centered. So values above 1 suggest that that community is, has more activity indoor, and values below 1 means more activity outdoor. So just as a couple of examples, the light blue time series here is for Boston, and we find that there's a peak in indoor activity in the colder months and a trough in indoor activity in the summer when it's quite nice in Boston. Whereas somewhere like Phoenix, they have the peak in the winter in indoor activity, but another peak in the summer due to there just being in unbearable heat in Phoenix at the time. And so this really kind of gave us a picture across the country for every single US county. There's 3,000 US counties. For every single US county across weeks, across time, it gave us a picture of what indoor activity looked like. So then our question was, is there really a geographical structure to this, right? We saw it had a reasonable amount of heterogeneity, but we were really looking for geographical structure here. And so we just kind of processed these through a time series clustering approach, and we found that really there was kind of just 2 big clusters in the United States. One was a northern cluster that looked more like Boston, where indoor activity only peaked in the winter, whereas the southern cluster kind of had indoor activity with a smaller amplitude, but then peaking maybe twice a year, both in the winter and a smaller peak in the summer. And so this is, really kind of helping us understand, again, behavior, but at a very, very large scale, and understanding geographical structure in that behavior. Just within the section, the last example, of course, I've been talking a lot about behavior, but we also care about disease. And again, getting at disease data at a fine scale, while this was possible for SARS-CoV-2, isn't possible for other respiratory infections. So in this context, we tend to use administrative healthcare databases, in particular insurance claims data, to better understand, for example, what influenza prevalence looks like at a county and weekly scale across the United States, but also what health behaviors that are hard to track at a fine scale through public data, like vaccine refusal, look like at a county and weekly scale. Now, of course, insurance claims in the United States requires people to seek care, have insurance, for a particular physician to participate in that insurance. And of course, we need that physician to report a case that we can then track. And so really, we're seeing a tip of the iceberg here with respect to all cases of disease or a particular health behavior. So we try to be very careful to capture these different measurement processes as we think about our estimates for both disease and health behavior. So in the last few minutes here, what I want to do is then just kind of talk about, now we've put together a lot of these data sources to both capture spatial temporal heterogeneity and behavior, as well as disease. And so how can we put this to work to better understand the heterogeneity in the disease dynamics that we observe? Because of course, during the COVID pandemic and every year during flu epidemics, RSV epidemics, et cetera, the heterogeneity is really one of the challenges that makes taking public health action very, very challenging, and making predictions very challenging. And so the first example here is just kind of coming back to this idea of a patchwork pandemic or epidemic, where if we were really wanting to understand what transmission potential looked like in every location across the United States over time, what we'd really want to understand is, what the transmission potential of just that location is. We'd want to capture how susceptible that population is, and of course, we don't want to just include spatial heterogeneity, but also that connectivity between locations, both social and physical connectivity between that location and every other location to better understand how the transmission potential is being driven by their neighbors. Now, writing this down kind of intuitively is fairly straightforward, but of course, then once we start digging, each of these components is driven by a number of social and environmental and economic and public health drivers that each have their own spatial temporal heterogeneity. And ideally, we would want to understand all of this mechanistically and be able to put it into a mechanistic model to make predictions. Now, I would say we're not quite there yet. And so what we can do in the meantime is at least think about this as a data-driven problem and try to put together all the different layers of data that help us predict this. And so we attempted to do something just along these lines, and this is a work in progress still, where we really wanted to kind of estimate transmission potential, which we described as a effective reproductive number in RT, but sort of localized to a location I at a time t, and thinking about cases that were generated by just one location j, which we can then put together for all locations j. And so we capture all of the various factors that go into those three components here, and plug in these opportunistic data source based estimates that we've been deriving for each of these features that helps us capture that transmission potential at a location over time. And of course, this helps us get at a map of what transmission potential, what RT looks like in a spatially resolved way. It can help us think about spatial interventions, really help us think about trade-offs between things like social distancing versus vaccination, and how, again, we really need to be thinking about not each community as an island and taking their own independent actions, but really affected by the actions of everyone around them, whether it be local neighbors or faraway neighbors. Can also think about kind of scenario planning, especially with variants during the COVID pandemic. This was something quite critical to be thinking about, and I don't think, and I think especially in a pandemic context, this kind of work would be is relevant. The second problem I'll mention is, we're really thinking a lot about kind of the seasonality of respiratory infections. So in the United States, we see similar patterns of, wintertime surges in infections like respiratory infections like influenza and RSV, similar to Europe, where we have kind of peaks in the onset in fall and peaks in the winter. But the unique thing in the United States that we additionally see is that there's a lot of spatial structure to how how influenza and RSV kind of progress through the U.S. So it's been well known for a while that onset of both influenza and RSV are in the southern part of the country, and then it moves from there, sort of northward. And there's a reasonable amount of consistency to this across seasons. And of course, the dogma with respect to seasonality of respiratory infections really has been around environmental factors driving this seasonality. But of course, we know that there's a wide range of factors that can lead to seasonality of respiratory infections, right? So certainly, factors like temperature and humidity matter, but these don't matter just in an outdoor context, but also indoor temperature and humidity. There's host response factors that influence susceptibility that have to do with the environment, but also have to do with behavior. And then there's, of course, big behavioral components here that really change the temporal dynamics of when and how communities are mixing. And all of these influence R naught, and so also influence the onset of respiratory infections. And so what we're trying to do right now is put together, we put together, again, big data sources, opportunistic data sources that help us estimate each of these factors, even ones that haven't been considered in the past, with a strong sort of emphasis on the behavioral components. And we're using that to better understand why flu onsets in the southern part of the country, for starters. And then the second component to this is to think about factors like human mobility that might help spatially diffuse infections throughout the country. I think understanding pathogens, especially respiratory ones, where we don't tend to think as much about the social dynamics, while with sexually transmitted disease, that's always been on our mind. I think thinking about these things mechanistically is absolutely critical to better public health mitigation and response. And of course, this type of work needs to be done in peacetime settings so that we're ready for crisis time. Lastly, the example I'll share is from kind of health inequities work. So of course, in the United States, we have a dire problem with this, but really this is a global issue where for most infections, we see vast socioeconomic heterogeneities in where the burden, which part of the population is dealing with the burden, both morbidity and mortality of these infections. We see this with COVID-19 in the US and with influenza. And I think all of us could argue that there's that there's factors at the micro scale that are really driving this, both within communities, but also between communities. But the truth is that there's also factors at a meso and macro scale that are really kind of, because they're baked into how our society works, are making those micro scale processes just really, really challenging to deal with on their own. And until we kind of think of this as a multi-scale problem, we won't be able to resolve it. So we did work pre-pandemic, kind of really thinking about this across scales. First of all, thinking about it at an individual scale and generating models that bake in different mechanisms by which disparities can arise in populations, and using that to kind of think through how these mechanisms drive disparities, but then also how they synergistically come together to really amplify disparities. In addition to the individual level, we thought about this at a population scale and in a spatial context to really think about at that meso and macro scale, what are the factors driving these disparities, but also really kind of thinking about the measurement processes here and thinking about how our inability to survey equitably and equally across different communities really amplifies these socioeconomic disparities. And now we're really trying to kind of take advantage of a lot of the newer data sources to update our understanding of these disparity driving factors. These were data sets that were absolutely not available to us 4 years ago. And so the field can really kind of be investing in this going forward. So just a couple of parting thoughts. Really, I think investing in behavioral surveillance, especially in peacetime situations so that we're ready for crisis times, is important. I really do find that these opportunistic data sets provide opportunities, but we really do need to approach it with caution, and especially to not contribute to the growth of health disparities, and to kind of figure out ways to make this type of work sustainable. The landscape scale is something I'm a big proponent of focusing on, because I think really there's we can see landscape level heterogeneity arise both as a result of individual level processes, as well as through just more emergent phenomenon on higher scales. So really kind of integrating interacting elements of the health and physical environment and social environment to predict social and spatial heterogeneities and disease burden, and then eliminating health disparities is where we need to be. As a last point, I'll just speaking of disparities, I just want to plug some work that my group's been doing on the side that is outside our work on infectious disease dynamics, but it's a look inward at our field of infectious disease dynamics and modeling to understand what the imbalances and inequities in our field are. So we've been analyzing the literature within our field and looking at who is publishing papers in our community, and if we measure that by gender, we find that the vast majority of of papers in our field are written by male authors. When we look at it by race, ethnicity, we find that most papers are written by white authors, and it's really not an issue of just authorship biases, but also when we look at citation practices, we find that articles that are authored by women, first and last author, are up to almost 30% undercited, while papers authored by male authors are tend to be oversighted relative to what they should be. And so in addition to really kind of working on public health disparities, I think it's really the job of our community to really look inward as well and think about the imbalances and inequities. And I think if we really address them now, we'll be looking at a future that's even better. So with that, I'll thank my wonderful group, some excellent collaborators, including Vittoria Kalitsa, who's based at INSERM in France, and my funding sources, and be happy to move on to discussion with you all now. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that incredibly interesting talk. We will open the door to any questions. Just raise your hand if you have any, or even just speak up. Jose, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for the talk. Very interesting. Yeah, looking at heterogeneities, spatial, temporal heterogeneities, looking at the world out there, but also looking inside our community and how we have some inequities there as well. Yeah, thank you. Very, very interesting indeed. You mentioned you had one slide about data. Yeah, and I remember during COVID, we gained access to all these fabulous data sets. I was working in the Department of Health in Australia back then, and data coming from mobile companies. We even had at one point they had rolled out a system by which people, anytime they went to a venue, they had to check in, and they would use that to with their phones. They would display the vaccination status. So they had to be vaccinated. But all that data was being recorded, and from the Department of Health, we gained access to that. So we knew all the places that people were visiting, and then we could link that to new cases, and then identify whether certain settings were at a high risk of having transmission events or outbreaks associated with them. So yeah, those were wonderful times for the epidemiologists. We were, but then all that stopped, and no longer have access to that data. Did you have a similar experience? Like, did you gain more access to data during the pandemic? And how do you think we could make progress in making that data available during peacetime, so that we're better prepared for actually making good use of that when the time comes?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jose. That's a really important aspect of thinking about this, right? And I don't think we can just kind of be in our academic settings and think about how to take advantage of this data. We really need to be advocating for its use as well. So I completely agree with you that there were some wonderful efforts during the pandemic to collect data, whether it be mobility data or other data that were focused specifically on the pandemic and for those purposes, and the specificity of that data was fantastic. But as you say, most of those data collection efforts those specific ones have been paused, or permanently stopped, right? And certainly that was what we found in the US as well. So what I think we have a better chances with in terms of sustainability are data sources that aren't specific to epidemiology, right? So in the case of mobility data, there are companies that are constantly tracking, right, based on the GPS location, GPS-based apps on our phones, the Uber and the Uber Eats and so forth, right, on our phones, is tracking information anyway, all the time. And that information is used by marketing companies as it is. So those data are collected, crisis time or not, pandemic or not, and are sort of gathered and shared in a variety of ways. And so I think those data sets we have a much better chance of having access to in a sustainable way. And I think they tend to have better coverage and lower bias because they, really it's just about everybody using their phone and it's not something specific to a pandemic response. And so we've, in the US, we found, and I think this is true in a lot of places, including Europe, where those data sets are still available. And I think that's a real boon for our field.
I can maybe ask a question on a related note. You mentioned you have a lot of data and etc. But what do you think is the biggest missing piece that would, if you would have that you can really understand these behavioral aspects better?
Yeah, so on the behavior side, honestly, we've it's been such a flood of data where before 2020, so many of us wrote pieces about the importance of behavioral data, but complete lack of it. So usually behavioral data came from very small, like social science studies, right? Interviews or surveys and things. And so the scale at which and the quality and really the quantity of data that we have on the behavior side, I don't know if I would get greedy enough to ask for more at this point. I think we have plenty on our hands to understand a lot of different components with. But I think in terms of other biological data, that's really where we're missing things, right? So immunity is something that absolutely remains a black box to us, and getting at data at a large scale in a geographically resolved way would be incredible there. And really, in addition to behavior, I think that's the big piece that is keeping us from being able to make predictions accurately.
Thank you for that. Yeah, true. The amount is staggering, and perhaps the bigger problem is working through that amount than the actual data itself. Yes. Jose, go ahead. Unless there's someone else.
Yeah, there's someone else. Yeah, but yeah, it was the last bit that you showed about gender and race inequalities for authors. Was that based in US only, or was it? Yeah, okay.
So no, it's sorry. Please continue. I can answer in a second.
And yeah, were those results that you expected, or did it take you by surprise?
So I can come back to the slide. So these are results for all papers in our field. Now, one of the biggest sort of methodological challenges we found ourselves in having is really how to define our field, right? Everyone would agree that infectious disease dynamics is a very, very interdisciplinary community. And so it's not as simple as like going to the flagship journal for our field and looking at all the papers there, which is what other fields have done for this kind of analysis. And so defining the field was a challenge, and happy to chat with anyone offline about that. But once we did that, this really is meant to represent the entire community. Now, one thing we've had to do, so for the gender dynamics, that's for everybody, but because there's a reasonable amount of data, we have been able to break it up into, for example, global North versus global South, and especially for the race ethnicity results, we found that it makes the most sense to look at those in a country-specific way. So this happens to be the US version of the figure, but honestly, other places that we've been able to do this, it hasn't been that different. But the reason really is that because the race ethnicity makeup of different countries really does tend to vary, and the definitions of race ethnicity in different places is different. We really need to do that piece in a country-specific way. about your second question in terms of was this surprising? So certainly the fact that there are inequities, being a woman of color myself, right? I certainly wasn't surprised that there, that there are imbalances and inequities in both authorship and citation in our field. The part that was surprising and particularly depressing is how flat the time series is, right? So looking back over the last 20 years, there's been, a slight increase in those numbers for both gender and race ethnicity, but really we have a lot more work to do. And so I was really hoping for a stronger positive trend here, and that was sadly not there, and that was surprising. So, highlights that more work to be done for sure.
Yeah, very interesting. Looking forward to seeing it published
soon. Yeah.
We do have one more practical question in the chat. Are you happy to share your slides with us?
Sure. Yeah, I can do that.
Then just if you want to have access to the slides, just drop us a message. I'll send our email address and we will make sure you receive them.
And like I said, I'm happy to have offline conversations with anybody if any part of this was of interest and you'd like to hear more. So.
If there's no more comments, really don't feel afraid to speak up. Otherwise, thank you so much for this amazing talk. We'll end here. This is the end of this season's series of talks, but we will be back in the fall, so keep an eye on the channel you found out about this meeting. Thank you all so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Cheers, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
So Eva, as everyone is signing off, I had a quick question. Are there US colleagues that you all have joined the series? Is that
as speakers or as
certainly as
audience?
Speakers I'm here, but as audience, is it because I did notice some US colleagues on there.
Those are people that we are generally in contact with. We have semi-regular updates with some US colleagues, both at the CDC and at universities. Exactly.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, if that's something you all ever open up, I think there would certainly be interest here. So yeah. Wonderful. Thank you so much again for having me. Take care.
Bye.